patronal festival to you all, and the blessings of St. Fursey come to you all. I first encountered St. Fursey in the early days of my coming to the Diocese of Norwich, and I was appointed to be Vicar of St Mary's Southtown and St Luke's Cobbin in 1984. And soon after that, I went to Walsingham to a meeting of the Anglican Confederation of Catholic Priests, and they were planning a joint pilgrimage to Borough Castle to celebrate the evangelism of St Fursey, and also a combined meeting or pilgrimage with the Federation of Catholic Priests from Suffolk. So the idea was that the clergy of the Norwich Diocese would gather in Norwich and come by boat down the river, Wensum, down to Borough Castle, and similarly the clergy from Suffolk would come down the river Waveney down to Borough Castle in that direction. A very nice event it was too. And the preacher was the new Bishop of Norwich, Peter Knott, and he preached a sermon about St Fursey. I never heard anything about St Fursey before then, and Bishop Peter Knott spoke about St Fursey and also the first bishop of East Anglia, St Felix of Burgundy. And Bishop Peter gave a very interesting sermon and told us about how St Fursey, representing the Celtic tradition within Orthodox Christianity in Britain, he came from Northern Ireland in about the year 630, and he was born round about the turn of the century, about AD 600 or so. And he was the child of a local nobleman called Fintan. And Northern Ireland at that point was called Ulaid, Ulster. And he had two brothers, Phelan and Altan. And such was the devotion of St Fursey to our Lord. He had a burning desire to preach the gospel and to serve the Lord with every fibre of his being. And he persuaded his two brothers, Phelan and Altan, to come with him on his spiritual pilgrimage to evangelise that part of Ireland. And he had two priests called Goban and Decal, and the five of them formed a small community, and they got on with the job of preaching the gospel. They were sort of a monastic community, one of the very early ones in Ireland. And he had a vision, an out-of-body experience of what life in the world to come was like. I shall mention that a bit more in a minute. And after that, he had a profound desire to cross over the Irish Sea and come into Britain, because he had learned of all the pagan Angles and Saxons in eastern Britain who were in need of the gospel being preached to them. And they came, the five of them came to East Anglia, and the new king, Sigurd, gave to St Fursey Borough Castle to be his monastery in the area. It was a very great Roman fort. If you've never been to Borough Castle, to the site of St. Fursey's monastery, it's well worth a visit. I hope to have a pilgrimage there later this year, because it will be our 25th anniversary. And also Bishop Peter spoke about St. Felix, who was the first bishop of East Anglia from about the year 630 to 647. And Bishop Peter suggested that Felix represented the Latin aspect of Christianity here in Britain, because he had been ordained bishop by Archbishop Honorius. But in actual fact, I later discovered that Felix had learned his Orthodox Christianity at the monastery of Luxwell in Switzerland, which had been founded by St. Columbanus, which was also a Celtic foundation. So the Celtic tradition of Christianity here in East Anglia was very strong, and the prominence of the round tower churches is perhaps a suggestion of Celtic influence there. So let us rejoice in the life of St. Fursey. And we learn more about him from the first English historian, the Venerable Bede, who was a monk in Jarrow. And Bede didn't think very highly of the early British church, because the early British church had failed to preach the gospel to the Angles and Saxons. As the pagans came from the east, the British people tended to flee to the west and nurture their Roman Celtic Christianity from Wales and north of England. So, but that wasn't altogether true, because they eventually did involve in evangelism later. But what I would like to share with you in a bit more detail is what the Bede said about St. Fursey. It is in his book. If you've never read the history of the English Church of People from Bede, I suggest that you can get it off the bookstore, and it's a very fascinating read too. So here we go. I apologise for reading it, but here we go. Yeah, I can't improve upon his story. While Sigbert still governed the kingdom, there came out of Ireland a holy man called Fursey, renowned both for his words and actions, and remarkable for singular virtues, being desirous to live a stranger for the Lord wherever he had an opportunity should offer. On coming into the province of the East Saxons, he meant East Anglia, he was honourably received by the aforesaid king, and performing his usual employment of preaching the gospel by the example of his virtue and the efficiency of his discourse, converted many unbelievers to Christ, and confirmed in his faith and love those who already believed. In short, he built himself the monastery, wherein he might with more freedom indulge in his heavenly studies, and there, falling sick, as the book about his life tells us, he fell into a trance, and quitting his body, from the evening till the cockcrow, he was found worthy to behold the choirs of angels, and to hear the praises which are sung in heaven. He was wont to declare that among other things he distinctly heard this: the saints shall advance from one virtue to another, and again the God of gods shall be seen in Zion. Being restored to his body at that time, and again taken from it 3 days later, he not only saw the greater joys of the blessed, but also extraordinary combat with evil spirits, who by frequent accusations wickedly endeavoured to obstruct his journey to heaven. But the angels protecting him, all their endeavours were in vain. Concerning which particulars, if anyone desires to be more informed, that is, with what subtle fraud the devils represented both his actions and superfluous words, and even his thoughts, as if they had been written down in a book, and what pleasing or disagreeable things he was informed of by the angels and saints, or just men who appeared to him among the angels, let him read the little book of his life which I have mentioned, and I believe he will thereby reap much spiritual profit. But there is one thing among the rest which we have thought may be beneficial to many if inserted into this history. And when he had been lifted up on high, he was ordered by the angels that conducted him to look back upon the world, upon which, casting his eyes downward, he saw, as if it were, a dark and obscure valley underneath him. He also saw 4 fires in the air, not far distant from each other. And when asking the angels what fires those are, he was told they were the fires which would kindle and consume the world. One of them was of falsehood. And when we do not fulfill that which we promised in baptism, to renounce the devil and all his works, the next of covetousness, when we prefer the riches of this world to the love of heavenly things, and thirdly of discord, when we make no difficulty to offend the minds out of neighbours, even in needless things, and fourthly of iniquity, when we look upon it as no crime to rob and defraud the weak. These fires, increasing by degrees, extended so as to meet one another, and being joined, became an immense flame. And when it drew near, fearing for himself, he said to the angel, Lord, behold the fire draw near to me. And the angel answered, that which you did not kindle shall not burn you. For though this appears to be a terrible and great fire, yet it tries every man according to the merits of his works. For every man's concupiscence shall burn in the fire. For as everyone burns the body through unlawful pleasure, so when discharged of the body, he shall burn in the punishment which he has deserved. And when he saw one of the 3 angels who had been his conductors through both sides, defended him from the danger of that fire, he also saw devils flying through the fire, raising conflagrations of wars against the just. And then followed accusations of the wicked against him, the defence of the good angel in his favour, and a more extended view of the heavenly troops, as also of holy men of his own nation, who, as he had long since been informed, had been deservedly advanced to the degree of priesthood, from whom he heard many things that might be very salutary to himself or to all others who would listen to them. And when they had ended their discourse and returned to heaven with the angelic spirits, the three angels remained with the blessed Fursey, of whom we have spoken before, and who were to bring him back into this body. And when they approached the aforesaid immense fire, the angel divided the flames as he had done before. But when the man of God came to the passage to open against the flames, the unclean spirits, laying hold of one of those whom they tormented in the fire, threw him at him, and touching his shoulder and jaw, burned them. He knew the man, and called to mind that he had received his garment when he died. And the angel, immediately laying hold, threw him back into the fire. And the malignant enemy said, "Do not reject him whom you have received, for as you accepted the goods of him who was a sinner, so you must partake of his punishment." But the angel, replying, said, "He did not receive the same through avarice, but in order to save his soul." And so the fire ceased, and the angel, turning to him, added, "That which you kindled burned in you, for had you not received the money of this person that died in his sin, his punishment would not have burned you." And proceeding in his discourse, he gave him wholesome advice for what ought to be done toward the salvation of such as repented. Being afterwards restored to his body, for the whole course of his life, he bore the mark of the fire, which he had felt in his soul, visible to all men on his shoulder and jaw, and the flesh publicly showed, in a wonderful manner, that the soul had suffered in private. He always took care, as he had done before, to persuade all men to the practice of virtue, as well as by his example as by preaching. But as for the matter of his visions, he would only relate them to those who, from holy zeal, desired reformation and wished to learn the same. An ancient brother of our monastery, still living, was wont to declare that a very sincere and religious man told him that he had seen Fursey himself in the province of East Anglia, and heard these visions from his mouth, adding that though it was in most sharp winter weather and a hard frost, the man was sitting in a thin garment when he related it, and yet he sweated as if it had been in the greatest heat of summer, either through excessive fear or spiritual consolation. And that's from Book 3 of the Bede's History of the English Church and the People. And Fursey was very much inclined to have these visions. It occurred several times, and so he was a very holy man, and Bede thought very highly of him. And here is what is called St. Fursey's Lorica, or a prayer, and this is attributed to St. Fursey. And here it is. "The arms of God be around my shoulders, the touch of the Holy Spirit upon my head, the sign of Christ's cross upon my forehead, the sound of the Holy Spirit in my ears, the fragrance of the Holy Spirit in my nostrils, the vision of heaven's company in my eyes, the conversation of heaven's company upon my lips, the work of God's church in my hands, the service of God and a neighbour in my feet, a home for God in my heart, and to God the Father of all, my entire being. There. I don't think we can improve on